The plane smelled like reheated coffee and too many perfumes. Jaime slept against my chest, cushioned by a blanket that smelled faintly of baby powder and my own sweat, his breath warm and quick against my collarbone. The man beside me kept his knees turned slightly inward so as not to touch us. He smelled of sandalwood and something cleaner underneath, like an expensive bar of soap that had been rubbed until only its memory remained. The engines were a hum that lived in my molars. I held him with one arm and tried to stop the tremor in my hands with the other. If this reaches you and you want to follow on, stay until the end, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Like the video, leave a comment with your theory, was he a savior or a trap? And tell me where you stand. It matters more than you think. I had been awake for 36 hours. My mother's breathing had slipped into something shallow and polite the night before. The hospice nurse had said we could come back in the morning, that she'd be all right for a spell. But I know hospice talk is its own language for making strangers feel less guilty. I had my apron folded in my bag, my last wages crumpled into a credit card envelope, and a baby monitor that rattled like a dying radio when it tried to pick up the machines in my mother's tiny room. We were on the flight because the specialist at the hospital in Atlanta had called. Somewhere during a 12-hour shift, a nurse had texted saying there was a possibility, a chance, that the transfer might mean treatment, or that there might be a second opinion, or, at least, someone with a different stamp on their name who could say the word we wanted to hear. The truth was a throb behind my eyes. I wanted anything that might change the shape of the next weeks. Jaime shifted, let out a small sound that might have been sleep or hunger. It was enough to make me move. People on planes are practiced at indignation. The woman across the aisle pinched her lips. A man 3 rows back tutted like a judge. A kid in an overhead seat glared as if he had been personally inconvenienced by the existence of babies. I had learned to hold my gut small and private to make it into something polite and manageable. It had been a long time since anyone offered me more than a glance. The man beside me reached out before I could say no, palm landing on Jaime's blanket with the ease of someone practiced at being useful. He didn't ask, he only adjusted the blanket, working his fingers like the quiet scissors of someone who cared for things. His hand was calloused at the knuckles, not raw but not soft. There was a small pale line on the back like a healed snag. He moved with the kind of economy people with money have. No wasted motion, no apologizing for space taken. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was low, not quite a baritone, not quite close enough to be intimate, just close enough to be noticed. Luca's hand stayed on the back of my head for a beat longer than necessary, and then withdrew. "You have a son?" he asked Jaime, because Jaime had made a small sound when he turned in my arms. "Jaime," I said, and the name felt like a prayer. "He's 3 months." Luca nodded. "He's sleeping now." His observation was simple, but not flippant. He looked at Jaime as if cataloging something precious and small that someone else might take. There was a peculiar tenderness in the way he smoothed the blanket, the same movement as his earlier gesture. I found myself watching his knuckles. There was a misshape to them, a crookedness that made his hands look older than his face. The small pale line became a scar when he flexed his fingers, short and white and oddly eloquent. I wanted to apologize for the faint, to explain the cheap coffee, the sleepless nights, the bills, the smell of antiseptic at my mother's bed. I opened my mouth and closed it on the words. I had a reflexive shame about being fragile in front of strangers. But Luca's eyes, dark as espresso, held something like comprehension, a light flicker, nearly human. He didn't pry. The flight landed, and the world resumed its ordinary offenses, phones chirping, overhead lights obediently bright. People shuffled out with the practiced impatience of commuters who wanted minor irritations obliterated. Luca stood and offered his hand. Not to me, for I had Jaime, but to the overhead bin as he lifted my carry-on free and slid it into place as if it belonged to him to do such things. At the gate, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen with a motion that was perfunctory, a man who lives by appointments. He spoke into it in a language of clipped courtesy. "We'll be there." "Yes, she can come." He said one number and then pocketed the handset like a card. People around us did not notice. Marco noticed. Marco had the look of a man who found jobs and then performed them without asking permission. He appeared as Luca lowered himself into a driver's seat that had been waiting, dark glass and leather cooling in the airport sun. Marco's eyes landed on me once, and then somewhere behind me, and he made a small note. I read the movement as an acknowledgement. "You don't have to," I began. "You do." Luca's voice came from a place that sounded more like an observation than a request. "Name?" "Ellie Sullivan." "Ellie." He said my name like someone testing wood for knots. "Say you're going to let us help." I wanted to say no. I wanted to stand on the curb and count the cents in my wallet like a theorem to be solved. I wanted to keep the decision small and mine. But when Marco opened the door to a car whose leather swallowed the sun, and the driver lifted Jaime into a car seat placed with practiced exactness, it felt less like an offering and more like a pivot in a map I hadn't known I was carrying. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were actually kinder than the planes. People moved through their grief in coupons, statements, signatures, forms that made emotion into work. My mother lay quieter than she had been the afternoon before. Machines made soft insistences. Nurses had voices like rope, steady and necessary. I had been there enough to know the contours of watching. You sit, you wait, you talk when the room needs air. I had read the silver code pamphlet the hospice left in my mother's drawer. I had pretended to understand the schedules for care. The specialist we had been promised turned up in a suit that looked like a kept secret, introduced himself with a card that was too heavy for its content, and nodded at the patient with a face like polite grief. Luca was there in the corner as if he had been placed there by a direction I couldn't see. He arranged a chair so that he could see us from the doorway and the window. And Marco folded into a corner like a coat left on a peg. A woman, Mrs. Vasquez, arrived that evening with a casserole and practical words tied around her apron. She had known my mother for years, had come by with a pot of rice, a dishcloth, and a willingness to say what everyone else was thinking. "You can't be everything to everyone, Ellie. You can love them until you can't." We tried response, then comfort, then the old rituals. My mother let my hand rest in hers the way a sea might rest a gull on a shoreline. Her skin was warm but thin. She hummed something nobody else in the room recognized, a sound from a house we had once shared. The radio, a neighbor's music, the hum of an old refrigerator. When she spoke, it was in fragments. Names came out like flotsam. Jaime, kitchen, key. The word key landed like a stone in my throat. It was a small metal thing my mother used to hang by the door, the one she swore to always keep, the one that later I would tie to a string and wear. For now, it was just a word she repeated as if reminding someone else. The doctor used a word I had scanned for in search engines on nights when hope is both a risk and a debt. He said comfort care with careful eyes. He said, "We're here to make her comfortable." He did not say everything else. My mother took my hand and squeezed so gently I could have thought I imagined it. I told her it was okay to rest. She smiled, small and private. I was small and private, my breath loud in my ears. When she died, it was like the end of a sentence I had never been given the chance to finish. There was no dramatic lightning. There was the slow window lamp dimming of someone folding up herself. I sat on a plastic chair that yielded like a confession and held Jaime against my chest. Luca stood by the doorway with his hands in his pockets, his sandalwood scent now a presence in the room that felt both protective and claustrophobic. I thought then of the worry stone and of the key my mother had kept hung by the door. I put a finger inside my shirt and felt the cool metal of a tiny pendant I had stashed once and then forgotten. My own key necklace, cheap, scratched, a promise sewn in metal. The funeral was small because money is small and pride is large. The neighbors came in measured waves. Mrs. Vasquez hired a man to dig. Marco stood at the back with a coat buttoned tight, a cigarette held like a question but never lit. Someone from the church sang. People said the things grief had trained them to say. Someone offered to take Jaime for a night. I refused because that was my right, the small stubbornness that keeps you tied to the last duties and the last smells of a person you loved. After, people came with casseroles and condolences, and the house, our house, suddenly felt like a museum of small things. The mug my mother would set in the sink, the chair she had patched, the appliances with their sticky buttons. I did the laundry, answered the bills, and tried to decide what to do next. For a while, the days were a series of small tasks that kept me from crumbling. Get Jaime fed, put out the trash, pay the electricity. The bank sent a letter of its own compassion. The landlord knocked on the door with the polite threat of eviction if the rent wasn't made current by the end of the month. Luca's calls were precise. He would text me an address, a time, then follow with a single, oddly casual line, "Bring Jaime." His messages read like invitations, kindly, unavoidable. He had sent someone to pick up groceries without asking, and a silk blanket for Jaime that smelled faintly of sandalwood and something else, old books perhaps. When he arrived at the house one afternoon with Marco and a woman who wore an apron and folded her hands with the exactitude of someone who keeps houses clean and secrets cleaner. "Mrs. Vasquez," the woman said, and that name carried a warmth like coffee ground fresh. Mrs. Vasquez nodded and hugged me as if I were a neighbor she had watched grow up. She was a practical person who did not ask for explanations and did not mince the truth. She said simply, "You can sleep when you can. Let us help." Luca watched the exchange and then, in a manner that made me both grateful and wary, handed me a small box wrapped in tissue paper. Inside, beneath the tissue, was a wooden worry stone. It was smooth and shaped like something my mother might have chosen, modest, round, brownish with grains like rings in a tree. It fit my palm like a word found for a missing thing. On the box, there was a single card with my name in handwriting neat enough to be a signature. "I thought he might like something to hold," Luca said. "It's good for traveling." I pressed the stone into my pocket and felt the familiar hollow there again. It had a trait that was both absurd and tender, insignificant, useful, and strangely belonging. The key necklace around my own neck felt suddenly heavier. There was the sense of being measured, appraised, and then placed in an order I didn't choose. That night, after he'd left, a message sat in my phone. A single number, an offer to transfer a sum that would clear the rent, finally, and set aside a cushion for groceries for 3 months. There was a line after it, "We can do more." No explanation, no promise, just currency in a world where currency buys time and silence and a night's worth of breathing room. I opened the message over and over, as if reading it would make it less dangerous. I had bills, of course. The sum would unbend the pressure of constant notes and overdue notices. It would mean not having to count out silver pieces for the laundromat. It would mean not sitting up with Jaime at night while the landlord's voice hummed like a mosquito in the background. It would mean freedom in the most practical sense, not being required to work 2 shifts tomorrow and worry about who would hold the baby if the car broke down. But there is a difference between freedom that buys the next week and the kind that buys you forever. Luca's money was a hand that could fix roofs and also lock doors. He called once, and when we spoke, I asked, because that is the only bargaining tool I had left, what he expected in return. He did not laugh. He said quietly that he expected nothing I couldn't say yes to. He said, "I want to help," like a man reciting the simplest truth. "I don't want charity," I told him. Telling a man who had offered a fortune that you did not want his charity is like refusing a raft while clinging to a stone. It is noble and foolish at once.
You will call it an arrangement, he said calmly. You will call it a convenience. You will call it what you need to call it. Call it by any name that helps you sleep. Call it by my name if that makes it easier. I want to ensure you and Jaime are safe. That is all. His voice had a gravity I could not measure. It wasn't shrill or loud, just the kind of intensity that made a room smaller. I asked practical questions. Who would be involved? Where would I live? Would my mother's funeral remain private? He answered with specifics and not specifics, the way men with power answer. Enough to settle the smallest practical fear, not enough to reveal the mechanisms. You can have time to decide, he added, as if giving time were a gift. However long you need, Ellie, but there are arrangements that require signatures. I laughed and the sound surprised me because it was sharp and brittle. Arrangements, signatures, the language of contracts felt like a net thrown over my life. I thought of my mother's hands and the way they had made a place for me that involved small economies. A stained spoon ritual, a scuffed chair that told stories about where we had sat through hard nights. I thought of Jaime and how his breaths come like a metronome that keeps me honest. I need more than words, I said. He paused. When men like him pause, it is a small opening.
He said, "Come to dinner. We'll talk properly. Bring Mrs. Vasquez if you want someone else there." I said nothing for a long time after that. The night fell and rose, and I could not sleep. I turned the wooden worry stone in my hand like a key, like something that might unlock a better choice or lock me into a different life. I imagined a house with lights on at the end of a long street. I imagined a child's shoes that didn't have to be mended every week. I imagined a rent check with a fat number that made a collector's voice fall silent. But I also imagined being watched. I imagined Marco standing at the edge of my street with his coat collar up, watching the house like a godfather watches his choir. I imagined a key necklace that later might be explained as belongership rather than protection. I reminded myself of the rules I had always kept. You do not sign anything you do not understand. You keep your child safe. You maintain your pride even if it is in tatters. You ask for terms that protect not only your immediate needs, but the shape of your future. When Luca had come to the restaurant that night, an old Italian place that smelled of garlic and rosemary and things that make you believe in comfort, he arrived with two men, Marco, efficient and unblinking, and a quiet one who carried himself like a shadow. The table was set near the wall, away from the hum of other diners. Luca ordered without looking at the menu, and when he spoke to me, it was in that same quiet tone that has a way of making commands sound like suggestions. You could have what you need, he said. A place, money, a woman to help with Jaime. We'll make sure you're taken care of. In return, I ask that you let me know where you live and whom you trust. I ask that you accept assistance and that you consider my counsel. His words were soft and precise. They landed like a hand on my shoulder in public, supportive and irrevocable. I asked what counsel meant. Small things, he said. Choice of school, medical people to see, help with bills. Nothing invasive. I want you safe. And if I say no? I asked. The question tasted like a dare, like something I had not allowed myself to voice. He smiled then, a little, and in the way he moved, I saw the scar at his knuckle catch the light like a white seed. Then you will be safe in different ways, he said. There are always costs to every choice, Ellie. That was the sentence that did not let me go. Costs. Every day I walked a ledger line between what I could bear and what I could not. The next morning I woke with a decision forming like a bruise. I would go through with a meeting. Not a marriage, not a surrender, but a negotiation. I would set terms. I would insist on time, on legal counsel, on boundaries. I would keep Jaime safe. I would demand that any agreement be explicit and written. I would not trade my child's future
for a promise that came with a scent of sandalwood and with men who watched like sentinels. When I told Luca my conditions, he listened as if cataloging furniture for later use. He did not flinch. He said, "We like terms." He placed a key on the table in front of me, small, heavy, on a chain. He did not press it into my hand. He set it down like a thing to be considered. The key was polished and older than it looked, worn at the edges. The pendant of my own necklace against my sternum suddenly felt like a child's version of that same idea. Access, belonging, perhaps entrapment. He left the key on the table and said only, "Think on it." I thought of my mother saying the same things I had heard in my head for years. Choose, Ellie. Don't be swept. Keep Jaime safe. The worry stone was hot in my palm with the heat of the restaurant's candle. I pressed it until the grain marked my skin. When I walked out into the night, Marco's coat stood like a sentry by the car. Luca handed me a card with a time on it and a place. "No pressure," he said, and then, almost as an afterthought, "But when doors are offered, you weigh them not just for what they give, but for what they ask." I kept the key in my pocket that night and slept with both hands over Jaime. I thought I had made the right move by setting conditions, by choosing language that protected me. But the world is not a ledger. It is not always possible to list the costs beforehand. There would be signatures and terms and the soft erosion of privacy. There would also be a bed where, for once, the lights would stay on. The next morning, there was a letter in my mailbox, a photograph of my mother, slightly faded, smiling like the sun at the edge of a storm. On the back was a single sentence in Luca's handwriting: "For when you need to remember, you are not alone." I walked to the mailbox clutching it like a child might clutch a promise. I dropped the worry stone into my palm and felt the key press into my thigh. I told myself I would keep negotiating, keep the agency that had gotten me through nights. I would ask for legal counsel, for time, for clarity. I would not say yes at the table. I would not sign anything without a layer of protection. But there are men like Luca who own more than a bank account. They own the smell in the room when they arrive, the way an offer feels like rescue. And when that rescue is placed before a person who has been washing other people's dishes for years, who has been knitting temporary roofs out of scrap and hope, the math becomes more than numbers. It becomes hunger, safety, a learned obligation to survive. I took Jaime inside, closed the door, and looked at the key necklace on my chest. The key felt heavier than it had before. I put it against my palm and made the most adult choice I could. I called Mrs. Vasquez and said, "Come over, for the night. I want you to hear this man speak." She arrived before sunset with a bag of groceries and words that were neither judgment nor charity. She sat in my kitchen and rubbed her hands together and asked me to pour her coffee. I poured it and watched the steam rise, and then watched my phone buzz with a text that would change the shape of things. It simply said, "Dinner tomorrow. My place, your terms. Come with whoever you trust. Be honest." I read it 3 times. I felt the room tilt and then right itself. The wooden worry stone warmed in my pocket. The key on my chest seemed to hum. I was going to a dinner that might be the beginning or the end of several things. I was going to go with conditions. I would protect Jaime. I would speak the truths I had rehearsed in the mirror at 2 in the morning. I would ask for papers, for counsel, for a clause or two that would keep us safe. I promised myself that I would not be rushed into a choice I could not undo. When I hung up the phone, Mrs. Vasquez folded her hands and said, simply, "You have to make him earn it, mija, all the way." I nodded because she was right. I clutched the worry stone until the skin of my palm whitened. I would make him offer more than money. I would make him offer terms that kept my life mine. I would ask for witnesses, for lawyers, for binding clauses that couldn't be erased with a smile. And yet, when I lay down that night and felt Jamie's weight against my ribs, I could not stop the sense that the world was tilting towards someone else's plan. The sandalwood scent had started to live in my dreams. The misshapen knuckle came to me like an omen. I felt simultaneously the relief of a looming end to financial panic and the cold prickle of something unnameable. The choice before me was not simply financial. It was moral, emotional, and practical all at once. I knew I would go to dinner. I knew I would set my terms. I did not yet know whether my terms would hold. I did not yet know whether the key Luca placed on the table was, at once, an answer and a trap. I slept fitfully, and in the morning a surveillance car, one that might have been coincidence or might have been a practical fallacy, sat 2 houses down while Jamie babbled and reached for the key pendant that hung at my neck, glittering faintly in the sun. When the driver downstairs called to ask if we were ready, I gathered my nerve, my paperwork, and my mother's old key, and I went out the door. The day felt like the hinge on which the next years might swing. I did not know which way it would fall. The gate was a breath of iron and ivy. Luca's driver opened it with the casual authority of a man who expected obedience from metal and people. The house beyond was a hulking thing of stone and late sunlight, terraces stepping down like stages of a life he could buy and sell. A valet took Jamie's stroller and lifted him out as if handing a trophy back to its rightful place. Jamie laughed and reached for the air, like the room might hand him toys. Inside, the scent that had arrived in my dreams, sandalwood and something like old money, wrapped itself around us. Lamps burned low. Paintings watched from gilt frames. There was a piano in the corner, and a man in a tailored jacket who smiled as though we were expected and also inconvenient. Luca came from the shadows as if summoned by the light. He was smaller in person than in memory, but his eyes cut into the room the way the sun cuts through fog. He kissed Jamie on the head and then offered me exactly the charm that had lived on the edges of my nights. A steadying hand, a voice that made danger sound like an invitation. "You look tired," he said. "Please, this is your home for the evening." Mrs. Vasquez stayed close to my side, hands folded like an anchor. She wore no surprise and no fear, only the quiet armor of someone who had seen too much to be startled by wealth. She had brought an extra bag that she said contained soup and a pair of sensible shoes in case we needed to leave quickly. The practicalities in her pockets steadied me as much as the worrystone did. We were led through a dining room that felt designed for ceremonies. The table was long and set with linen that did not puff from use. There were no other guests. Luca had arranged the night for us alone, the space between us and the world reduced to the clink of crystal. He spoke of nothing at first, small things, the weather, Jamie's laugh, where the best bread in the city was made. It was careful conversation, the sort that coats an evening in ease so that a hand can later slip into a pocket without being noticed. He poured wine and told me later that he did not drink much, and I believed him because his restraint was part of the show. When the food arrived, a simple roast that tasted better than it had any right to, he placed a folder on the table the way a man might place a ring. It was thick, leather-bound, the edge of documents visible like a tongue of paper. My stomach clenched. "You asked for papers," he said. "I thought it would be better to show you what we mean." I kept my fork halfway to my mouth. "I asked for the chance to have counsel," I said. "I asked for time." "Of course," he said. "Of course. Read it. Take it home. But understand this. I don't like leaving things to chance. Sometimes an offer needs a signature to become real. Some people waste other people's patience." Mrs. Vasquez put her hand over mine under the table and squeezed. We both knew patience was not mine to waste. I opened the folder with hands that did not tremble, but did not feel entirely mine.
Contracts, clauses, contingencies. The language was beautiful and predatory. Indemnity, assignment, non-compete. Phrases that made the future into a tidy, purchasable object. There were lines about rent, about custody, about access to the unit in the event of maintenance or safety concerns. Phrases that promised me security in exchange for a lot I had not yet named in my head. "See," Luca said softly. "Clean, binding. We can close this week. Or we can take our time." "I prefer speed, but I will wait." "I won't sign anything tonight," I said. It was a quiet declaration, shaped by the nights I had rehearsed it, by the image of my mother's photograph in my pocket. Not until a lawyer and witnesses have reviewed it, not until I understand what this would mean for Jaime's life. He smiled in a way that said he enjoyed the challenge. "Bring the lawyer in then. I can have mine present. Lawyers expedite these things. They are the grease for the wheels." He tapped the folder like a man tapping a watch. "Or we can do it the old way, trust and handshakes. I like the old way sometimes. It reveals the real person." Mrs. Vasquez's voice came without flourish. "You can have a lawyer in here if you want, Luca, but the signing will not happen while a child is between a mother and a man offering an exchange." "Ah," Luca said, leaning back as if the room were a sea and he were watching the waves rearrange themselves. "Prudence, admirable. But tell me, mi querida, what would you need exactly? Money? A place to live? Legal security? I have resources. I can guarantee." He listed things like a man naming instruments, a lump sum to clear debts, a guarantor on a lease, an account set aside for Jaime's schooling. Each item fell into my lap like a bandage on an open wound, soothing, necessary, and each came wrapped with a stipulation that lived in the fine print. "I don't want charity," I said. "I want autonomy, protection that isn't a chain." He sipped his wine and watched me like a man listening to a chord he couldn't yet identify. "You want guarantees," he said. "I can provide them. But guarantees cost different things. Contracts are not just words. They are mechanisms. He paused, searching for a word that would both placate and unsettle. Invitations. "Sometimes they're bars," Mrs. Vasquez said. Luca laughed softly, then set the glass down with the care of someone who liked to break things with intention. "You are a good negotiator," he said. "I admire that. Bring the lawyer in. Ask for witnesses. Ask for a guardian ad litem if you like. I will have documents ready." It felt like a victory that he agreed to those things, small and bright. I felt the relief like a lightening of a weight. But there was a shadow in the way his hands moved across the table, in the way his eyes flicked toward the pocket of my coat where the key pressed against fabric. He reached, almost in passing, and his fingers closed over the pendant that rested against my chest. It was an act that could have been casual had it not been loaded with intimacy. He did not ask to see the key. He simply took it and turned it in his palm, examined the tiny scar along its shaft where my mother's name had once been stamped. He smiled at that same sun-edged smile in the photograph. "You carry everything with you," he said, "even the doors." I felt something cold. "Give me that," I said. My voice would not be sharp. It couldn't be. But it was firm. He handed the key back as if it were a thing returned to him by a servant. "Forgive me," he said. "Curiosity, habit. Old men collect histories like buttons." After that, the conversation frayed into smaller negotiations. Timing for review, the name of the lawyer I trusted, specifics about custody language that would forbid overnight stays without notice, clauses about privacy, penalties for breach. He agreed to some changes, balked at others, suggested replacements that sounded like loopholes in doctors' handwriting. His attorney, when she arrived later that night, smiled like a woman who could write the world in clauses and make it bind.
At one point, after the plates had been cleared and the coffee lulled us into a softer pulse, I asked the question that had been shaping the nights. Why me? Why help at all? He looked at Jaime asleep in his own stroller, then at my face, and answered without moving his mouth much. Because I like to fix things, he said, and because I like to be the person who fixes them. The sentence had two sides. For a breath, it was a comfort. For a longer breath, it was a warning. We left with papers to be sent to my lawyer, with his team's promise to add binding witnesses and an escrow clause for the funds. He kissed Jaime again on the forehead and told him in a voice sweet as any lullaby that he would see him soon. The driver put us into the car and closed the door. The night was warm and smelled like the city and engine oil. In the rearview mirror, I watched the house recede, windows glowing like patient eyes. The surveillance car from the morning sat 3 houses down again, unmoving, its window reflecting the streetlight. It felt less like coincidence now and more like punctuation. My phone buzzed as we eased into the flow of the avenue. A message from an unknown number arrived. A photograph of Jaime asleep, the key pendant catching a slice of light on his tiny chest. Under the picture, a line of text, "Sleep well, we'll talk tomorrow." My hands tightened on my son's stroller until I could feel the tendon in my wrist. Mrs. Vasquez made a small sound beside me, half prayer, half curse. I put my thumb against the worry stone in my pocket until my nail pressed the rubber like a pulse. We had bargaining rules now, lawyers, witnesses, clauses. We had Luca's smile and his offer, and the hard knowledge that someone had walked into my life and rearranged the furniture. I thought of my mother's photograph folded in my bag. I thought of the key that carried both access and memory. I thought of the ways a promise can become ownership and a rescue can become a cage. We rode home in a silence that was not peace. When we reached the building, a single light burned in my kitchen window, as if someone had stayed up to watch for me. I carried Jaime inside and closed the door, and, with hands that suddenly felt less steady than they had in Luca's dining room, I latched the deadbolt and slid the chain across. On the table lay the leather folder he had given me, placed there as if I had left it on the way out. I did not remember opening the door or putting it down. The photograph of my mother was on top, and Luca's handwriting, clean, authoritative, spelled the same line. For when you need to remember, you are not alone. I sat at the kitchen table and let the house breathe around me. Jaime slept in the next room. Mrs. Vasquez boiled water and hummed a hymn that felt like a tether. I dialed my lawyer and then let the phone ring out, listening to the sound it made as if it were a bell summoning something inevitable. Outside, the surveillance car idled for another long minute, then rolled away into the night, its taillights like a pair of eyes closing. I pressed the worry stone until my palm ached and thought about how to make a man like Luca earn the right to help me. Not with words only, but with conditions that could not be smoothed by a smile. I laid the folder open on the table, the clauses like a map of future steps. I would make him put it in escrow. I would ask for notarized terms and a guardian. I would insist on a 30-day review window and the right to rescind. I would protect Jaime with language that could stand against charm. And yet, even as I planned the legal barricades I would raise, I felt the key at my throat vibrate under the cloth of my shirt. It was a small sound, a reminder that some doors opened by other people and some locks were made by promises whispered over candlelight. I turned the pages and read until the lines blurred, until the city outside softened into the hush of midnight. Then I called Mrs. Vasquez into the kitchen, and we sat with the folder between us like an ember. Her fingers traced the edge of a clause, and she nodded. "You make him earn it," she said again. All the way. I looked at Jaime through the open door, at the slow, even rise of his back, at the fine hair on the nape of his neck. I thought of promises and traps, of the way rescue sometimes smells of sandalwood and wolves. I decided that night under the hum of the refrigerator and the watchful photograph of my mother, That I would not hand him the key without cutting it on both sides first. I would not trade my child's nights for the comfort of a bed with lights left on. And I would not be surprised if, in asking all of that, Luca's patience started to look different. Not merely disappointed, but dangerous. The phone buzzed again. This time, a caller ID I knew lit up. My lawyer. I answered. "I'm on my way," she said. "Don't sign anything. Take everything to me." Outside, a car passed slowly. The worry stone warmed in my palm like a pulse. Tomorrow, we would go back to the table. Tonight, I would guard my son and count clauses and sleep with the light on, because there are bargains that cannot be undone by dawn. The choice had not been made. The hinge had not yet swung.
But something had shifted in the room between us and the man who wanted to fix lives. I folded the photograph of my mother and placed it under the stack of papers, like a talisman and a warning both. Then I pulled the key inside my shirt and lay awake, listening for the sound of footsteps that might be a promise or might be a threat. I slept in fits and starts, waking to the small, steady warmth against my chest with a key pressed through cloth. Jamie shifted once, murmured, and turned toward me in his sleep. Every creak of the building set my teeth on edge. Every distant siren made my palms clench around the worry stone until the grooves dug white crescents into my skin. Morning came thin and gray. Mrs. Vasquez moved like a careful animal through the apartment, setting the kettle, laying out cups. She spoke little. Her humming was a soft, steady thing that kept the air from fracturing. When the lawyer arrived, she stood behind me in the kitchen as if she were a living hinge. My lawyer, Mara, had the exact posture of someone who spent a life inside doors that did not belong to her. She clasped her bag and looked at the folder on my table with the professional cool of a person who both feared consequences and liked them. She read the clauses once, twice, then folded the papers along the edge of the table as if tucking a map back into its envelope. "We'll do this on neutral ground," she said. "No signatures tonight. Not without me. Not without a notary and escrow. No transfer of guardianship without a court order or a guardian ad litem. You understood me last night." "I did," I said. My voice still carried the sand of sleep. "He, Luca, said he wants to help. He left the folder. He left the key. I want him to earn it. I want him to prove he can be trusted with Jaime." Mara's mouth tightened. "Good. We'll draft an agreement. Medical power of attorney limited and revocable, a 30-day trial period under court-appointed supervision, background checks cleared and notarized, escrow of funds. We'll insist on quarterly audits." She hesitated, choosing non-legal words. "And keep the key for now." Keeping the key felt like admitting to fear. It also felt like possessing the last truthful thing in the ledger of my life. I held it under my shirt, thumb finding its familiar weight, and nodded. We spent the morning drafting, telephoning, arranging. Luca called twice. Both times, Mara's assistant put the phone to speaker, and I listened while she took notes. The first call was lacquered with concern and warmth. "I want to come by," he said. "I want to see Jaime. I want to make sure he's comfortable." "Not without counsel," Mara said sharply. "We will meet at my office with documents prepared." There was a pause. I heard a soft intake of breath. The almost smile that could be both invitation and blade. "Of course," Luca said. "Of course. Whatever you need." When he came, it was just after lunch, in a coat too light for the day. He stepped into the lawyer's waiting room as if he had been invited into someone's life for years. He greeted Mara with a kiss to the hand, and then turned to me with a look that measured and cataloged, like an appraiser who had decided halfway through whether an object was valuable. He offered condolences with a practiced tilt of the head, and then, without pause, laid a new envelope on the table. "For the boy," he said, "for the immediate needs. Think of it as a down payment on stability. Mara opened the envelope without ceremony. Cash, clean and discreet. Her eyes flicked to mine and then back to him. "We will accept interim assistance," she said, "but it will be held in escrow. Any transfer will be court documented. We will not hand over guardianship based on charity." Luca smiled, not wholly disarmed. "I like terms," he said. "Clarity suits me." His fingers brushed the edge of the papers as if to rearrange them. "But understand, delays can cost a child the ease of a bed, the right medicine at the right hour. I would hate for Jamie to go without while you weigh language." The room tightened. Mrs. Vasquez's hand found mine for a fraction of a second. Mara's jaw set. "Then let us expedite," she said, "but the law will protect him, not your promises." Luca's eyes found mine. There was something in them, behind the polish, a restlessness, a patience that resembled waiting for weather. "I'll sign anything," he said. "I'll agree to oversight, to checks, to whatever makes you comfortable. I want to be careful. I want to be respectful. I want him to know he has options." I remembered the last time someone had promised to keep a light on. I remembered a hand on my shoulder that had been both compass and cage. "You'll earn it," I said, "all the way." He nodded, and the nod was an agreement and an assessment both. He reached into his coat and produced a small card, embossed, the name of a foundation I had never heard of. "You will have access to our social worker," he said, "a trusted person, someone who can help transition Jamie if needed." Mara lifted a brow. "Your foundation's representative will be vetted by us, no unilateral decisions." "Naturally," he replied. Then, with a shift almost too slight to catch, he asked, "Would you allow me to meet the boy? To sit with him for a moment, just to see him, no promises beyond that." I thought of the night, the way his voice had filled the empty corners of my apartment, the quiet certainty with which he offered solutions. I imagined Jamie's small face peering toward someone new, of the sweet trust children give that can be exploited, and of the danger in denying him an adult who might be kind. Mara looked at me. Mrs. Vasquez looked at me. Luca's hands were open, palms up, a silent offering. The key at my throat felt hot. 20 minutes, I said, finally, in the lobby, with Mara. No gifts, no money, no photos. He smiled as if the terms were a relief. "Of course," he said, 20 minutes. Outside, the city shrugged and kept moving. On the walk back to the elevator, I noticed, across the street, a white van parked too long in the same place. The driver sat with his hands folded, looking at his phone. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself 1,000 small lies, enough to keep moving. In the lobby, I put the key into a small envelope and slid it across to Mara. "Hold it," I said. "Keep it safe." She did. Her thumb covered the flap like a promise. Luca spoke softly to Jaime in the waiting area, light and even, no hurry. Jaime blinked, curious, then reached for the brochure I had in my bag. The man's voice lowered to the level of toys and cartoons. I watched him, every line in my body ready to move, to pull back, to protect. When the 20 minutes were almost up, Luca stood. He bowed slightly to Mara. "I understand," he said. "I will await your terms." Outside, as we walked back up the block, the white van had gone. No taillights, no driver, just an empty space and the faint impression that someone had been waiting for the right face to leave the lobby. "You're doing the right thing," Mara said. "Don't let him rush you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that careful papers and court orders could keep a man like Luca at bay. But as we passed a shop window and I saw my reflection, a woman with a boy and a key and a map of clauses between them, I felt the hinge of the world shift under my feet again. That evening, when the city melted into a palette of sodium lights and the apartment hummed with its usual small noises, there was a soft, polite knock at my door. It was not Luca's knock.
It was someone else's, measured, deliberate, not the warm knock of a friend. I paused with Jaime on my hip, the envelope with the key heavy in my pocket. Mrs. Vasquez stopped her humming mid-note. Mara, who had not slept at our place, but whose voice could still be heard in my head, had said, "Trust the paper, but watch the man." I opened the door. A courier stood there, a plain envelope in his hand, no return address. He nodded and shifted his weight as if he wanted to be elsewhere. "For you," he said. I took the envelope. It was thin. My name on the front in a hand that looked disturbingly like Luca's, the same tidy script that had written on the photograph of my mother. Inside was a single photograph I had never seen before. Jaime asleep in my arms, taken from an angle I recognized. The street outside, a step back, a window with a dim lamp in the background. On the back, scrawled in the same hand, "For when you need to remember you are not alone." I felt the room tilt. The light in the kitchen seemed to dim. Jaime stirred and opened one eye, blinking at me as if to ask the same question I could not answer. Across the hall, the elevator chimed. Footsteps came and went, ordinary and oblivious. But in my pocket, the key sat like a secret, and on the table, the clauses lay like a scaffold.
Someone had crossed the line into my life and left a proof that they could see inside the rooms I thought private. The photograph was both a benediction and a threat. I wrapped my free hand around Jaime's small waist and pressed the envelope into Mara's palm. She did not open it. Her face was a map of careful decisions. "We proceed as planned," she said. "We file tonight. We get an order. We make it impossible for him to move without oversight." Outside, unseen, a car idled for a long minute, then rolled away. The sound of it was a closing curtain. I tucked the key beneath the lining of my shirt and listened to the house breathe. The bargains of night had not yet been decided by day. I put Jaime to bed with both hands, closing the door slowly, and sat for a long while at the kitchen table until the light in the window looked like a single stubborn eye awake in the dark. Some promises can be enforced with law. Others are enforced by the knowledge that someone knows your child's face at rest. And some are enforced by patience, the slow, exhausting kind that waits to see whether you will fold. When I finally stood, the envelope with the photograph between my fingers, there was a knock at the window, 3 soft raps, as if someone wanted to be noticed and not invited in. I did not look up right away. Outside in the stairwell, a shadow slid past the landing, quick as a breath. The city held its ordinary noises. A dog barking, a television laugh, someone arguing 3 floors down. But inside my apartment, the air had the new taste of calculated intent. I placed the photograph face down beneath the folder. I smoothed the papers until the clauses lay flat. I opened my phone and scrolled until Mara's number filled the screen. I pressed call and waited for the familiar ring. When she answered, I did not say hello. I only asked one thing into the small dark of the line. "Call a judge," I said, "and tell them to hurry." Mara's voice on the other end went cold and precise. "I'm on it," she said. "Don't let him in, not alone." I looked at the key under my shirt and felt its metallic truth. It could open doors, it could also make them close. On the table, the envelope with the stranger photograph lay like a second pulse. The day was not yet done, and the man who had offered rescue had already showed us the cost of admittance. At sundown, someone would come back to see whether I had taken their invitation. I set the folder in front of me and began to write conditions the way soldiers write maps. Distances measured, exits noted, time and limit and witness appointed. I would make him earn it, clause by clause. I would not let him trade contracts for the slow, quiet liberties a child deserves. Outside, the hallway light flicked on, and my neighbor's door thudded open. The building moved through its ordinary rituals. unaware that a hinge had been bent. I folded the sheet and slid it into the leather folder Luca had left, then pushed the folder underneath the other papers as if to hide it in plain sight. The key was warm from my skin. I stared at it until I could make out the slight nick on the metal. Someone had once sharpened it against a ring and left an imperfection like a scar. At 5:45, a car pulled up and the sound of a door closing reached my window. Footsteps approached, even and deliberate. I picked up the photograph and turned it over. The handwriting on the back had not been an offer. It was a symptom. The doorbell rang. It was Luca. His voice followed, soft against the wood. "May I come in?" I set the photograph down. I smoothed my hands on my jeans and walked to the door. Mara's presence like a blade against my ribs, even from the distance of a phone call. I opened the lock, then checked the peephole, then opened again. He stood there with his coat collar up and a quiet about him that made the hallway seem to lean in. He smiled when he saw me, as if we had returned to an earlier, easier gleam. "Good evening," he said. "I thought I'd stop by. I brought flowers." Behind him, where the street opened into the dim, a shadow moved across the pavement and the taillights of a car blinked once before disappearing. I held the key in my hand, the metal cool now, and felt the small, precise choice weigh like a scale between us. "Come in," I said, "for 20 minutes." He stepped over the threshold as if entering a room that had always been his.